Mabuhay or in Kapampangan, luwid kayo. Today's question comes from Anne of Southern California. Kuya Kirby, who was the first Filipino? Now before we answer this question, let us first clarify a few things. This video is not gonna be about the first people to ever live in the islands we now call the Philippines. Because if we trace the first ever human to ever live in the islands, that would span thousands of years, if not even hundreds of thousands of years given the recent discoveries. So yes, it is a simple yet very complicated question to answer, but let's get on it. Today, when we say Filipino, we refer to the people who are from the Philippines or with roots back in the Philippines. But it is important to remember that this was not always the case. In fact, it was never the case for the most part of our history. And you can learn more about this in my other videos, such as the one where I talked about why the Philippines was named the Philippines, or the first Filipinos in America, and I'll link them down below, so check them out after this video. Now back to answering the question. As I've mentioned before, the term Filipino was not always this inclusive identity, this inclusive term that includes all the people from the Philippines, in the Philippines, or with roots back in the Philippines. The word Filipino originally only applied to Spaniards who were born in the Philippines. So basically, when they first came up with the word Filipino, it only applied to white people who were born in the islands. And it doesn't even count the mixed or the mestizo population of the islands. Back then, it only applied to white people, pure white people who happened to be born in the Philippines, not even mixed. We, as Filipino people today, have only started using the term Filipino to identify ourselves back in the late 1800s, during the rise of Filipino nationalism and anti-colonial revolution. And perhaps the most well-known amongst the earliest people to embrace and reclaim this nationalist Filipino identity is none other than the hero Jose Rizal. Scholars like Leon Maria Guerrero III consider Rizal to be the first Filipino. Rizal's revolutionary writings played a pivotal role in planting the seeds of the modern-day Philippines, of the modern-day Filipino identity. He was instrumental in the development of this nationalist Filipino consciousness that we know today. But Jose Rizal was not really the first person to ever officially claim and reclaim this Filipino identity in a nationalist and patriotic sense. According to other scholars, like my lolo's own cousin, national artist and former Secretary of Education, Alejandro Roces, that distinction of being the first to reclaim and claim the Filipino identity in a patriotic and nationalist sense would be none other than Don Luis Rodriguez Varela, otherwise known as El Conde Filipino. Luis Rodriguez Varela was the first ever person to proudly and officially name himself a Filipino on paper, defying colonial limitations and exclusive definitions of the term. Don Luis officially reclaimed the term Filipino 66 years before Jose Rizal was even born, and 103 years before the Declaration of Philippine Independence. It was in the year 1795 when the Spanish monarchy had granted and declared Don Luis a count. And when he was given the chance to choose his own title, Don Luis Rodriguez Varela had chosen to become El Conde Filipino, literally the Filipino Count. But how does that even make any sense? He was a Spanish count, so how does that make him patriotic or nationalist? First, while we can never be 100% sure of his race nor the true makeup of his ethnicity, Don Luis was born in the Philippines and he fully embraced the islands as his home and the people as his own. And he did this through words and actions. He was one of those who had the privilege of studying in France during the age of the Enlightenment. Inspired by the revolutionary ideas sweeping Europe, he brought this knowledge and wisdom back to his motherland, the Philippines. He used these enlightened ideas to understand and address the issues and concerns facing the people of 18th century Philippines. He was an ilustrado, but despite being born and raised with such tremendous privilege, El Conde Filipino advocated for extensive social changes in the archipelago to overhaul this corrupted and oppressive colonial society. He stood up for social justice at a time when Western imperialism was rising to its peak and wreaking havoc across all inhabitable continents. He was a prolific writer who wrote not just for the sake of writing or academics, but to actually push for lasting social changes. In one of his most famous publications, the historic proclamation El Condor Filipino took a stand to demand the following: to demand equality for all the inhabitants of the islands, whether or not they were Spanish by birth. In other words, equality regardless of your race or the color of your skin. He demanded to improve the education system and even called for a free public primary education at a time when education, even in countries like the United States, was still limited to those with privilege, money, and power. He wanted the islands to break free from foreign influence in business. He wanted to promote local economic development to benefit the local communities instead of enriching foreign powers. He demanded Filipino representation in the Spanish Cortes, or the Spanish Parliament, so that the people of the islands can have their voice heard and their plights be addressed. He advocated for more participation in all levels of government as well as in the local church. Because back then, even within the Catholic Church, racism, oppression, exploitation, and corruption were still terribly widespread and targeted against people of color. He called for changes within the criminal justice system so that it would be fair for brown people, instead of always protecting white supremacy. So yes, using today's language, one could call him a Filipino scholar activist, one whose actions and words aroused and empowered many in the Philippines to take a stand against colonialism and imperialism. But on the 18th of February 1823, Don Luis Rodriguez Varela, along with his group who called themselves Sons of the Nation, were deported for defying colonial power. They were exiled and banished from the Philippines for demanding social justice for the people of the islands. El Conde Filipino, along with his fellow Sons of the Nation, were amongst the very first in a long line of Filipinos who were fighting for economic, political, and social justice in the islands we now call the Philippines. They laid the foundations for a nationalist movement that would later be taken up by the likes of Jose Rizal, the Gomburza, and the Revolutionary Katipunan. In 1887, 64 years after their exile, the young Jose Rizal published Nanami Tanqueray, the first of his two novels that inspired a new generation of Filipinos, including Andres Bonifacio, to take a stand, to rise up and demand equality, liberty, and justice, to fight for the freedom of the motherland, and to demand justice for the oppressed. In essence, and in its very core, claiming and reclaiming our identities, be it being Filipino or Filipinx or whatnot, is a powerful step and a political choice. And that being Filipino, despite the term having deep roots in colonialism, can also be grounded and be reclaimed to take a stand for liberty and justice. But this can only be done through taking actions for the love of the motherland and in the service of its people, our people. And that is it for me today. If you like this video and learned a thing or two, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to help me make more videos like this, show your support and please be my patron or get a copy of my book, Dakalpong Salamat. See you next time, or in Tagalog kita kits and in Kapampangan, Mikitix.